We have an interesting and straightforward question today from Julia. Why do so many fantasy stories pair slavery or harems with romance?
It's an interesting notion that in our literature, this theme of connection keeps showing up. To me, that points to the notion that there is something probably inherently erotic about a power dynamic, about a power differential. And I think that it speaks to some of the core male-female polarity. Men are stronger than women. Part of being drawn to each other, if you're heterosexual, is being drawn to someone a bit opposite than you. I think that even in homosexual relationships, often we see the notion of topping and bottoming, the notion of power dynamic in some way cropping up again, because that polarity creates erotic charge. And so I think the notion of a power dynamic in itself contains some archetypal, unconscious reference to the oppositeness of sexuality, penetration. I make the case in volume 2 of the book that I think in many ways the traditional yin-yang concept is an extended sexual analogy. Yang is rigid, hard, external, upward, dry, and yin is moist, receiving, dark. It's on some level, at what point are we just talking about a penis and vagina? And I think those things are referencing archetypal understandings, and that oppositeness, the opposites that bind into a whole, is a reference for love, is a reference for romance, and certainly is a reference for eroticism.
Yeah, I think about in fantasy stories, female slaves, women in harems, about as close to terminal, dominant, submissive dynamic that you can get. I mean, in today's age, it would be pathological, right? That's how extreme the dynamic is in these fantasy stories, that, well, I literally own this person. They are not just pretending to be my slave. They actually are my slave. And so in the realm of fantasy, you can let go of the pretense. They actually just, you're actually a slave. In this universe, the conquering warlords have enslaved all the women, and we're just going with that. And the story can unfurl once that premise is set up. And it is intriguing. I think I recently read I don't actually read as much erotic as you do, but one of the more recent ones I did read was exactly this. It was a slave. Like, it is exactly typical of this. And then she was basically surprised by what she was expected to do. And then she found that she was liking it. And it was this whole thing. She just went from denial to anger to finally acceptance to confusion to, it's just, all the
It's the 5 stages of grief. The 5 stages of grief over your erotic slavehood.
Exactly.
No, I think, dude, I think this is my contention, and I don't know how true this is, but I believe that on some level, you never stop being aware when you're reading a story that it is a fantasy. And that gives you that little bit of psychological distance to go much further in the fantasy than you might want to go in real life. But then likewise to engage with the actual archetypes, because you have the safety of it just being a fantasy. You're able to feel those feelings, experience those emotions, but with the unconscious perception that this is a fantasy, this is a story that's being told, this is a fiction. And I think even in real life, that's part of what we're doing, is we are co-creating fiction with our partner. Is we're going to say, hey, I want to tell this story about my archetypes, about my shadow, and I want you to tell the story of your shadow. And together we're going to craft this fiction and live in that world that is nonetheless, in a weird way, more true than the actual world, psychologically at least. One of my favorite quotes is, that's what fiction is for. It's for telling the truth when the truth isn't sufficient for the truth. And there's an interesting notion there that fictional world can somehow be more true psychologically than the real world, the objective world, let's say. Because we live in a subjective reality. That is our true experience on some level.
Yeah, I know. I think that sense of being removed from the story because it's fiction and giving you permission, I think that's a really valid point, because I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think a lot of these erotic stories that involve slavery or harems are always based in fantasy stories or science fiction stories, right? There's some like spaceship that comes and takes over all takes all the women or whatever, or
Sure.
mythological werewolves come and enslave the women or whatever. But correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think erotic stories that involve slave master dynamics actually no one's like writing about 18th century America, right? Where there's an actual slave in a plantation, right? No one is
No,
necessarily...
those stories exist too, to be totally honest. But even then, it's fictional to our modern world. There's all kinds of stories, by the way. By the way, mafia romance is a huge one with,
No way.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, dude. I mean,
Okay.
and again, I think the interest there is the statement of power, right? The willingness to commit violence. And yet, this is the interesting thing to me, even theme that I see in common among all of these stories, whether they're based in a pseudo-real world or in a historical fiction or a science fiction or fantasy fiction with werewolves or other planets like Gore, that was a world-building concept. The theme that I see in common is that it often ends up, I won't say always, but it very, very often ends up with love. There ends up with some experience of affection, care, romance, that the master falls in love with the slave at least falls in love with the master. There's some transcendence of emotion that often is the end result of all of these experiences. Now, that's not always the case. Look, the human imagination is vast and varied, so I'm sure there are stories that have no such thing. But that's a very common theme, I would say, is that it culminates in love. And part of the reason it is drawn in that direction is because after things have been stripped raw and bare and exposed by the slavehood, by the rawness of the intimacy, love is very frequently an outgrowth. We perceive, at least archetypically and psychologically, that we move in that direction. If you enjoyed our discussion, you can explore these topics in greater depth in the books of the Sex Like LSD series. Links are in the description below for Love is a Kink, The Architecture of Intimacy, and Structuring Desire, along with the associated workbooks.